Yes, I think that very much sums it up. Thank you very much for inviting me, Hamish. So I think I may be the only foreigner here. I am Danish. I am a consultant hepatologist at Aarhus University Hospital in Denmark. I am also a clinical professor of hepatoepidemiology, which means that I do a lot of epi research, but I also see patients with cirrhosis, patients with HCC. And I also serve on EASL's Policy, Public Health and Advocacy Committee. And EASL, as you probably know, is the European Association for the Study of the Liver. And that's really the reason why I am here, because I will tell you about EASL's involvement in the revision of the Beating Cancer Plan on the European level, and how that led to the development of a task force to try to strengthen the evidence base for HCC surveillance. All right, so in February of 2021, the European Commission launched its Beating Cancer Plan, which was really a plan that includes 10 flagship initiatives in 4 key action areas. It's prevention, early detection, diagnosis and treatment, and efforts to improve quality of life for patients with cancer. But the point for today's talk is the part about early detection. And the idea of this Beating Cancer Plan was to update the 2003 recommendations for population cancer screening, and those 2003 recommendations were for colorectal, breast, and cervical cancer. And the plan was to consider additional cancers such as prostate, lung, and gastric cancer. But the changes were to be informed by advice from the European Commission's group of chief scientific advisors. And EASL, and that included those on the Policy, Public Health and Advocacy Committee, were alarmed that liver cancer was not mentioned as one of the potential cancers. The next thing that happened was then that the European Parliament and its special committee on beating cancer, the BICA committee, chimed in with the European Commission and said, yes, we think it's a good idea to update the 2003 screening recommendations, and basing that on science. And that started a massive advocacy effort on EASL's part, and a task force on liver cancer prevention was established, and we wrote an open letter with action points, and you may have heard of that as the 10 asks. Later in August, EASL suggested amendments to the BICA draft report to the European Parliament, trying to introduce liver cancer into the recommendation. We started the EASL studio. This is from the very first EASL studio, and you can see the then President Thomas Berg and myself from my bedroom during the very first EASL studio episode. And we did a lot of things to raise awareness about liver cancer in collaboration with patient organizations like ELPA and DICE. I traveled to Brussels to advocate some more. But ultimately, in December of 2021, the final BICA report says that, well, essentially it said nothing about liver cancer, because our suggestion to include liver cancer has been completely removed from the Commission's report. All right, so at this point, the European Parliament has agreed that the European Commission should update the Beating Cancer Plan, and it therefore continues with the next step, which is the evidence gathering step. And that began in January of 2022 with the European Commission's call for evidence. And that call for evidence invokes the scientific advice mechanism. So the European Commission has a group of chief scientific advisors. There's 7 people in it. Under them, they have a group called the Scientific Advice for Policy by European Academies, SAPEA, which provides, as they say, independent, high-quality reviews of the evidence to inform the policy recommendations made by the group of chief scientific advisors. So, and it's really a consortium of academic networks, and one of those is FIAM, the Federation of European Academies of Medicine. And on that, on FIAM are Rebecca Fitzgerald and Harry de Koning. And Rebecca Fitzgerald is from Cambridge. She does a lot of work in esophageal cancer, and probably you know her very well. Harry de Koning is of liver cancer screening fame. He is the first author of the Nelson trial. But those two were the ones we tried to convince that screening for liver cancer. We presented to them the evidence that exists and try to explain to them that doing a randomized trial, individual level, is really not feasible because it has been standard of care in almost all European countries for such a long time that we thought it's not really feasible. And we know that there is a well-defined risk group of patients with cirrhosis. So that's what we argued to FIAM and SAPEA, and we did more advocacy on the part, on the side, for instance, launching an EASL policy statement on liver cancer screening and also introducing the EASL Studio policy dialogues. This is a snapshot from an online meeting where I tried to present EASL's case to Rebecca Fitzgerald, and the crux of the matter is that they only consider cancers for which there have been trials, randomized trials done that demonstrate the efficacy of screening. And so I asked her, do you really insist that there has to be a randomized trial? And she says, well, no, it's not a specific requirement, but it's impossible to get her to say what kind of evidence would then suffice. So really, essentially, they only considered for the new recommendations, they only consider cancers for which the efficacy of screening had been substantiated by randomized trials. So the final recommendation from the European Commission was to extend existing screening recommendations to also include lung cancer screening and prostate cancer screening, and then under certain circumstances, gastric cancers. So ultimately, all our work for EASL was unsuccessful. We did not get the recommendation for liver cancer screening, and I think we have to say we were never really close because there isn't a randomized trial, apart from the Chinese one in hepatitis B patients, and there's a lot of valid criticisms of that trial. So at that point, EASL decided to go in two directions. One is to continue the advocacy work for liver cancer screening, but that should be in collaboration with advocacy groups and ILCA. And then to make a separate group, which is the task force, who is supposed to discuss and come up with ideas about how we can strengthen the evidence for liver cancer screening based on the advice we have received from the group of chief scientific advisors. So, essentially, what we have to this point does not convince the group of chief scientific advisors that HCC surveillance is efficacious. So the question from EASL, the task force, is how can we produce stronger evidence for the efficacy of HCC surveillance in patients with cirrhosis? And that led to EASL Task Force 2.0, which I led and which included 40 members altogether. Some are in this room, experts in epidemiology, public health, and also clinical HCC. And we have had 3 online meetings. A patient representative was invited but did not attend. We discussed the pros and cons of different study designs, randomized trials, emulated trials, other forms of non-randomized cohort studies, case control studies, and then simulation. But the key issue that I think we have all taken away from this work, and which I think is like a major obstacle to moving forward, is that some think the randomization to surveillance or no surveillance is unethical, whereas others think that it's absolutely necessary to move the field forward. So that divides the task force members, and I think it divides hepatologists here and Denmark, where I am from, and in most other countries. The recommendation that we came up with is that an emulated trial is a feasible short-term goal that might strengthen the evidence, but we still don't know that it would be enough evidence to convince the group of chief scientific advisors to recommend liver HCC surveillance in their next update of the cancer screening recommendations whenever they are. A cluster randomized pragmatic trial, we think, is a long-term goal, and we think it's worth pursuing, but it is a long-term goal. And that's really where we are now. The current status as of today is that I have drafted a review that describes essentially what you have heard here. And I hope that EASL will express its support to those investigators who aim to follow our recommendations. EASL has a governing board meeting today, I think, where they will hopefully decide that the review I've drafted is worth publishing. EASL is not in a position to provide any funding to support whatever the review is going to recommend, which is an emulated trial or a cluster randomized trial. But I think that EASL's support for this endeavor should make it easier to get funding from elsewhere. And that concludes my talk.